Okay, all right, so before I share my screen and start walking you through what we in the group have done, I just want to set the stage for what we're talking about here today. So if you've been around the community a long time, you probably remember those days when at the community calls, the working group was saying, we have 1 or 2 proposals up for vote to add or change something in this to or in the CDM. We used to have these quite frequently, and we were constantly updating the CDM. And as our community has grown, we have deliberately slowed down on making those changes. Number one is because we're at a pretty good spot. We think the CDM covers most, if not all, of the use cases that are currently out there, and because as the community grows, it takes us longer for all of us to get on the same version of the CDM. It takes longer for all of our multitudes of open source applications and methods to catch up with said CDM version. And there's just a lot more downstream effects when we change the model. So we've deliberately slowed down. But as we've reflected over this past year, last year we released CDM version 5.4. We realize it's probably time to reopen those discussions. We have new collaborators, we have new working groups, and we want to make sure everyone knows the process in case we have missed something, in case there is something we need to do either to the vocabulary or to the CDM to make sure we are covering as many use cases as the community has. So what we've done over the past couple months in our working group is we've come back to this idea, and we've developed a process by which we would like to present today on how you might request changes to the CDM. As we were doing that, we realized that sometimes the things that we think might need to change about the CDM aren't actually a change at all. Sometimes there are other options that we can point you to, like an addition in the vocabulary or something like that, that would actually not necessitate a change to the CDM, but maybe just a conventional change or a change in how we are representing a piece of data rather than changing the entire model. So on top of this request process, we also created what we are calling a decision tree to help answer those questions. And really, when you come up and you're looking at your source data and you're ETLing it and you're really excited, and then you say, oh no, I have something that doesn't fit into the CDM, we want you to take this pathway and look at this decision tree, because instead of the first option being, if my piece of data doesn't fit in the CDM, therefore the CDM needs to change, that might not actually be the right answer. So what I want to take you through today is, number one, this decision tree. Then I'm going to share with you the process we've come up with on how we would like to see requests come through, should you make it to that point in the decision tree. And then I have my 2 wonderful volunteers. I've got Nagy and Davera Gabriel, and they're going to each give us a scenario, and we're going to work through their scenario in the decision tree to see what should they do with their problem, with their data that doesn't fit. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions, as I imagine we'll have lots of questions from the community. And I've already had some people sending me notes saying that they do have some questions and they're excited about today. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for you. This is where I'm starting. So I do not have slides, as I shared with Craig. But that's because I thought it would be more beneficial to you guys in the community if instead of slides, I put this information just directly on the CDM website, so you can immediately start using this process if you so choose. All right, so let's get started. And feel free to shout out questions as I go through this if you have them. I'm obviously open to discussion, and I just want to reiterate that this was a group activity, and we in the CDM working group came to this decision together. All right, so when you come to this website, this is on the CDM website, and if you want to get here organically, if you click on support, the top one says, help, my data doesn't fit. So you can immediately go bring you here. And the first question it's going to ask you is, do you have a documented network use case for this data? This could take the form of an upcoming study or a convention for how to store information. We in the working group, in the CDM working group, lovingly refer to this as one of Reich's laws. Christian will always ask you first, do you have a use case? So we wanted to make this the #1 question we are asking. Now, in this scenario, we're defining that at least 2 or more collaborators with data to contribute constitute a network need. So it doesn't have to be everyone in the community, but at least 2 or more collaborators with data to contribute. So let's start with no, I do not have a network use case. I have this item, but I don't really have a network use case as of now. So let's click on that one. All right, so it says, okay, you don't have a network use case. Next question, is this data element specific to your data source, or are there others in the community who might also have this data, but don't yet need it for a study or data model convention? Super great question. So I'm going to say no, there are others in the community who also have this data. I'm going to go here. And our answer is, you may not think we would say this, but leave it as is. You don't have a network use case, but multiple collaborators have access to the element you're interested in. What we say is, we suggest leaving it as is. Without a network use case, we don't really see the need to augment the model. However, if this is something you really do need for your work, you could consider a local change or a model extension. So if you click on local change, it'll take you here. And this is actually the endpoint of another one of the decisions that you can go through. And many people may not realize this, but it is entirely legal to make local changes to your instance of the OMOP CDM. You don't have to ask us if it's something that you need for your own work. Oftentimes this comes in the form of your own administrative information. Totally fine. The only thing we want to caution against is that any local changes you make cannot and should not be relied upon in network studies. But of course, if you had a network study, you would have answered yes to the question, I have a network use case. So you would have gone down a different path. And they should not be relied upon in network studies or supported by the open source tools. So if you make a local change, don't then run to the Atlas team and say, hey, I have this local thing I added. Can you please build it into Atlas? They will tell you no. But if you do have a network use case and there are some changes being made to the CDM, then we would, of course, work with the Atlas team to make sure that that data element or new table is going to be represented in the tools once that change is ratified and in a new version of the CDM. Okay, so let's make a new choice. Help, my data doesn't fit. Okay, so in this instance, I'm going to say, yes, I do have a network use case. The next question, and we actually push towards vocabulary first, and this is very important. The next question is there an existing OMOP vocabulary to support this new element? If you're unsure, please go check Athena. So I'm not going to go over to Athena, but I want to just emphasize why we are focusing on vocabulary here. In the past, and a lot of these questions are born out of some hard lessons we've learned along the way, there have been times in past versions where we ratified a CDM change, we pushed out a new version of the CDM, and then we realized, oh no, we created a new field that needs a standard concept ID, and we do not have standard concepts or a vocabulary to support this table. So the table sits there and languishes, and no one uses it, and then no one even thought about vocabulary. And so then the change that the person was excited for and we were hoping to use, and we had a use case for, it ends up not happening because we didn't think about vocabulary ahead of time. So this is not to say that you immediately need your vocabulary to be present and available at the time that you make your request to the CDM working group, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But it's just to make sure that, have you thought about it? Do you have some sort of vocabulary need? What is that need? Let's make sure we're looping in the vocabulary team. So I'm going to say here, no, there is not an existing OMOP vocabulary to support my request. So what happens? So then the next question says, is there an existing open source, meaning not proprietary or custom vocabulary that has not yet been incorporated? So we're basically saying, if we don't have an OMOP vocabulary to support your need, can we find one? Is it open source? Can we grab it and just, bring it in? So I'm going to say, yes, it just needs to be brought in. So what we put here is, okay, let's open a vocabulary request. We point you to the Vocab issue tracker, which is a great place to communicate with that team when it comes to if you know what vocabulary you need and where to go and that it's open source. It's very easy to open an issue there. And then it says, once that request is made, please follow the CDM request process. We'll come back to that. I just want to go down the other path before we do that. Okay, so say you need a vocabulary, you don't have, and there's not an existing open source or custom vocabulary. What do you do? So we're going to say no, there is no open source vocabulary for this data element. So we've decided it's really important to contact the vocabulary team here. And I put the team's channel, the link here, so you can communicate directly with Michael and that team. Reason being, sometimes there's not an open source vocabulary, but sometimes it's actually really easy to create one within the OMOP, the OMOP world and under the OMOP umbrella. A really good example, and I saw Gautam texting, a really good example is when we updated the payer plan period table. Gautam worked with the vocabulary team to create a new vocabulary to support that table. I want to say it maybe has like between 25 and 50 different concepts. It's not incredibly complicated for him to do, but he did take that step, and now you can use those concepts alongside the payer plan period table. So it's not necessarily that you need to have an existing open source vocabulary, but you could potentially create one under the OMOP umbrella to support what you're doing. So just as a note. All right, so now we are here. Once you've come to consensus with the vocabulary team regarding your needs, then please follow the CDM request process. So here's really like the meat of what we're talking about here. And so this is, if you go to this link, I'll drop it in the chat. Here we go. And this delineates all the different steps, and we've decided on 5 different steps for how to request changes to the CDM. Now, I will say these steps are more involved than they had been previously. If you've gone through this process in the past, I mentioned Gautam. Gautam did this before. They were a little bit more loosey-goosey, I will say. We were kind of like feeling ourselves out. This is more involved. So if you are not sure if you want to go through this entire process, I've put it pretty much everywhere. Please just reach out to us. If you need some guidance, if you think your item is relatively small, you do have a network use case and a vocabulary, but you're still not sure if it warrants a change to the CDM, please just reach out. We don't want you going through all of these steps, coming to find that you did a lot of work for nothing. So just let us know. We want to help you, and we want to help answer your questions. Okay. So this scope, we are talking about minor changes, as in new fields in existing tables, and major changes like breaking changes, meaning things that might break some of our existing open source tools or methods, and any additional tables. So those will be very involved. We'll need to make sure we have the proper voices at the table. And anyone can propose changes, like individuals, working groups, organizations, etc. All right, so I'm going to go through the steps pretty quickly because I know you all can read, at least I hope so. So step 1 is your proposal. So we request a document that includes a clear description of your change, and you must include the user guide and ETL conventions in the same structure as what is present on the website. Reason being is that it's really easy to propose a change, to put it out there. We need a column, we need a table, things like that. But it's really once you get in and you describe how would someone use this field or table and how would you ETL data into this field or table that it really makes you stop and think. And sometimes you might even stop there and say, wait a minute, I don't need a new column or table. As I think through this problem, I actually think I can use maybe the observation table or measurement table or something along those lines instead. We want your clearly defined use case, and we want an example of how your change or addition will be used in practice. We've got some examples here, but like either sample data, SQL code, diagram, etc. Just a thought experiment to tell us, how would you work with this change? So then once your document is ready to submit, please email, I see you, Diego. I will, after this call, I don't know why it's dead for you, but I will work on that. Thank you, Diego. So once your document is ready to submit, I've got a link here. This is actually an email. So if you email to this box, it will send a post directly to a separate Teams channel, and you can attach your document and it will go right there so everyone in the CDM working group can see it, and someone will reach out to you and give you some, oh, that one, okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Someone will reach out to you and tell you, whether your proposal merits further review, or give you some feedback as to, what you might want to do to change it to make sure that we can bring it to the working group meeting. All right, so after that, and we've decided, you've heard from a working group member, you'll have an initial presentation. So you'll be given like 15 or 30 minutes to present your document and anything else you feel will help illustrate your need. And we'll invite you to one of our working group meetings. And there's just like some potential decision criteria here as to how the working group might make a decision as to whether you should continue on in the process of the request, or a lot of times what will happen is we get a request and then we will brainstorm ways we could address your issue and your use case without actually changing the CDM. So there's just a couple different things here that will help the working group make their choice. Yeah, so if it's decided that you should move on, your proposal should continue on down the path, we haven't found a better way to address your use case, we will give you a preliminary decision and then open up a branch in the Common Data Model repository for you. At that point, we would ask that you apply your change or addition programmatically in that branch. If you're not a programmer, don't worry, we will have someone assigned to help you out. But really what we want to do is actually create a development version of the CDM with your change. And then what we would request is that you ETL some data, either real or synthetic, using your new table and field. And then you should create an example cohort that shows how you can use your addition or change in a real study. Again, this is born out of experience. It's very easy to think that a change will be important, and then you go to use it, and you realize the way we've written this, we can't really get data out very efficiently. We thought we would use it one way. It actually doesn't work that way when we put it into practice. We need to go back to the drawing board. So then, after you go through that, and we would expect also at this point in step 3, as you are working through that, you would have someone from the working group assigned to you to help work through any potential issues, to help you with your programming, that sort of thing. You will not be on an island there, but you just know that we would expect all these changes to be made in the branch and to see at least some SQL code or a cohort explaining how you would use this change in a true study. And then if you get to this point, you'll have a final presentation just showing, what you did, what you learned, any changes that were made to your original proposal. And then we will provide a final decision. We're still workshopping, I think, within the group how we're going to do this. Most likely we'll put a vote out within the working group as well as on the forums, just to make sure that the entire community can weigh in on the final decision. And then, should it be accepted, we would initiate requests for features in our tools so that we can use this new feature as per the use case. So that was a pretty quick rundown, but I think you guys can walk through it. The idea here is really we want to be stringent in our requirements here because there is a lot that goes into changing the CDM. There is a lot of downstream effects, and we want to be aware of that, and we want to be really thoughtful when we are changing the model moving forward. And so all of these things, like I'm saying, are born out of experience and what we've learned over the past few years. Okay, so that is about it. I do want to have Paul and Davera present their scenarios. Before I do, does anybody have any questions related just to the request process here that I've shown you on the screen?
So a quick question. Is this only related to things that are changing the ATL or the model itself, like the schema, or is also related to things like some description of the CDM or some constraint that is put in the CDM that is actually not part of the model itself, but is actually endorsed by some further tooling, for example?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, Diego. This particular 5-step process is really for changes to the structure of the model. So I'm thinking changes like adding columns or adding tables, or breaking changes like changing the names of columns that are used in pretty much all of our tools and methods, that sort of thing. In relation to what you're asking about, say like a conventional change, descriptive change, something like that, what we would ask, the best way to get a response is on our Odyssey, the Common Data Model GitHub, if you open an issue, or if you come to a CDM working group and bring it up there. At the beginning of every meeting, we actually have a 15-minute session where we ask for questions from the group. Because a lot of times what we found, people join the working group meeting with a specific question. So if you have something like that, please join, and we do have that time at the beginning so we can answer some of those questions and point you in the right direction.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, Claire, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Paul or Davera, do either one of you want to go first?
I'm good either way.
Okay. All right, well, since Paul was unmuted first, let's do Paul. What I'd like to do, Paul's going to present a scenario. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk him through the decision tree. And at each question, I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hand. So I'm going to say, have Paul read his scenario, and we'll say, does he have a network use case? Raise your hand. Put your hand down. No, he does not have a network use case. Raise your hand if you vote for that one, and then put your hand down. And that way I can see which way we vote, and we'll get him to some point in the tree and then tell him what he should do with his problem. All right, Paul, lay it on us.
Thank you, Claire. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So I have the pleasure of co-leading the medical imaging work group with Chan. And just as a plug, we meet every 2 weeks. At 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. And our goal is to try to tap all the incredible features we're coming out of medical imaging, from CT scans, MR scans, PET scans, just incredible phenotypes that we want to be able to link into OMOP. And so we've been actually getting together for about 6 months on trying to figure out how do we get features that we see on radiological exams and cardiology exams and have that granularity that we can tap into it. And so we did start with a network use case that we found that was generalized, that was used amongst most places. We certainly see that pulmonary nodules is a good example of a potential precancerous tracking that's done either in, this is done in breast cancer, this is done in chest, but basically if there's a suspicious nodule that is seen on an imaging study, basically they'll ask you to track it over time. And so if you watch a nodule over time, you can look at its morphology. It has all kinds of cool attributes to it, but often the volume and the doubling rate are of key concern because they describe potential vascularization and metastasizing parts of a cancer. And so our goal was to try to figure out a use case. How do we bring in these incredibly rich features of the attributes of nodules that we see within imaging findings into the OMOP data model? And so just to give you some basics of this, what we broke down in saying, and one of the major challenges we have is that we say, well, an imaging study is a collection of medical images. An imaging study can have multiple clinical findings. A patient can have multiple nodules, and each nodule, each imaging finding can have multiple imaging features. They can have a size, they can have composition, they can have location of them. And so one of the challenges that we have is we want to be able to track these nodules over time. So here's a good example of there's some great terminology work being done by the RSNA and the ACR, where they can describe the nodules with vocabularies. It is not SNOMED, but they created some vocabularies for describing the composition of pulmonary nodules into a enumerated list that can be really tied into prediction models to say potentially the classification of that cancer. So our use case is we would like to bring in, we know that imaging studies are done around the world, that lung cancer is not specific to Baltimore, Maryland, and that we know that multiple sites have a need to bring or have a desire to bring these rich imaging features into OMOP. We have, you think of all the lab tests we have, for every imaging study, we can have a ton of features that can go along with it. And so, Claire, is that enough of a background to start our game?
I think so. All right, I'm going to reshare my screen so we can walk through this. Okay. First question, does Paul have a documented network use case for this data? So please raise your digital hand if you think, yes, he has a network use case. Okay.
I must not have done well. I thought I had a good case.
All right, I'm seeing 23. All right, lower your hands, please.
Are you also going to count no votes?
Yes, I am. Yeah, that's why I want you to lower your hand so I don't incorrectly count a no as a yes. All right, so do you think no, Paul does not have a network use case? Raise your hand. Okay, Erica says no. I call you out. Okay. All right, so I saw 23 vote yes and only 2 vote no. So we're going to say yes, Paul has a network use case. Okay, next question. Does Paul have an existing OMOP vocabulary to support this new element? And this one, I feel like I had some questions for Paul. I don't know about you guys. So Paul, you mentioned that there is some vocabulary. Do we think it's actually in the OMOP vocabulary already?
And I can answer that. It is not. It is. So this group studied SNOMED, and they made additions to. They made an additional vocabulary that has not been added to SNOMED. It's called RADLEX for Radiology Lexicon.
Okay. So,
but
Paul,
it has been gone through a consensus building process for creating a generally widely accepted class of terminologies.
Okay. So Paul gave that one to us for free because he said, no, there is not an existing OMOP vocabulary to support his request. Okay, next question. Is there an existing open source vocabulary that has not yet been incorporated into the OMOP vocabulary? So anybody want to take a guess on whether RADLEX? So Aza, are you saying yes, it exists, it just needs to be brought in? I see Aza here. Okay, so hands up. Do you say yes, the vocabulary exists, it just needs to be brought in? Okay, I'm seeing 22 hands up, 24, 25. Scott is a big fan of RADLEX. All right, so lower your hands. So I'm at 26.
And Claire, okay. Oh, you want to go through the no's first?
Yeah, I want to go through the no's. Raise your hand if you say, no, there is no open source vocabulary for this data element. All right. And I actually don't know about RADLEX. I don't know if it's open source or not. but we'll see what Paul says in a minute. Okay, so we've got 5, 4, 4. Okay, so I'm going to click yes, because the answer we got to for Paul is you need to put in a vocabulary request to bring Radlex in. Is that correct? Is Radlex an open source vocabulary?
Yes, it is.
Good. Okay. So I think we got to the right answer then. So the answer, as I see it, is we need to make a request of the vocabulary team to bring in the Radlex vocabulary. Thank you, Ajit. He put it in the chat there. And then you can follow the CDM request process to identify those other elements in the CDM that need to be changed if you think they need to be changed. What are your feelings? Do you feel like the CDM needs to be changed to fit this imaging data, or if you have the vocabulary, is that all you need?
So unfortunately, it's much easier to change the vocabulary than to change the data model. So I'd be really happy if all I had to do is add vocabulary items. But the problem is a patient can have multiple nodules, and we want to track a nodule that's in the left upper lobe over time. And so we need to have some additional linking capability within OMOP to be able to handle. And we also wanted to maintain the provenance of what images that feature came from. And so we felt like that ability to have that feature provenance was not in the existing OMOP model. I did want to mention just briefly that we did bring Christian in to talk about the Radlex. And so you might be interested in his feedback about that. He also agreed that we should bring Radlex in, although he feels like, we probably need to be looking at it. It's more than just needs to be brought in. There probably needs to be considerable harmonization that needs to be reviewed as part of that process. It's probably not a simple thing just to add another, million concepts into the vocabulary.
The good thing is too, so I agree with Christian, it can be a big lift. But what I'm happy about then is that you've already talked about it, you already have a plan, and what we could do if you guys decide to put in a request to add those data elements to the CDM, then you can point us to your issue and say, or your conversation with Christian and say, hey, we've already talked about this, it's on their radar. And then if we do decide to ratify any changes you want to make or additions you want to make to the CDM for imaging data, then we know, okay, we need to wait on Radlex before we actually bring this in to a full version of the CDM. So that's perfect. All right, awesome. Thank you, Paul.
And also, I wanted to mention that nothing is holding us back from building reference implementations. So we're going ahead and just throwing Radlex into our 2 billion codes and building our extension table for imaging provenance just to explore the challenges with linking at the image finding level. So I do feel like reference implementations are really going to be key for us to vetting out what sort of key fields we want to have in that table.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good call out, and that's one of the things we also built into the CDM request process as well, so you'll be ahead of the curve with those reference implementations. All right, so we've got 15 minutes left, which is perfect. So Davera, I'm going to turn it over to you. Davera has our next scenario for a potential change to the CDM.
Great. Can I just share my screen real quick?
Of course. I have to tell you, these volunteers are fantastic. I just sent them some small little blurb about something silly, and they have slides and all the stuff I was not expecting. So
okay, so I don't have slides, but hi, I'm Davera Gabriel. I'm with Johns Hopkins University. I'm going to be talking about a use case in the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, or N3C. So N3C's network focuses on studying and research on COVID. And because it's COVID, we are actually encountering the need for lots of novel data elements. Currently, we have some new vaccines, the boosters that are new data elements. The researchers are developing a code or a concept for long COVID per their definitions. And we're also generating new data using natural language processing to extract out of text symptoms associated with long COVID. So Claire, given the fact that we, have all these new and cutting edge, data elements that we need, what should we do?
Great question. So let's put it to the group. All right, so I'm gonna steal the ball back, an old WebEx reference. Okay, so first question, raise your hand, your digital hand, if you believe Davera does have a network use case. Okay, I see some hands going up.
Claire, can we ask a clarification question?
Sure.
Is what's missing now an NLP piece? Is that like when you say we're missing data element? Is it just the NLP?
No, it's also we have novel vaccines. So the booster vaccines, for example, we don't have codes for those. The symptom, our definition of long COVID, we don't have a code for that.
Claire, I think your question is assuming this is one use case. This sounds like multiple use cases.
Yep, it definitely does sound like that. And I think you could have multiple use cases for your data element. But I think as long as you have one and you can document it and point us to it, that's all you really need. But it sounds like Davera, especially M3C, might have a lot of different uses for these data. Okay, so hands down. And then raise your hand if you think, no, she does not have a network use case. Okay. All right, so I had 22 with yes. So going 11 with no. So we are going to click on yes, she does have a network use case. Okay, next question. Is there an existing OMOP vocabulary to support this new element? And I think she answered this, but raise your hand, yes. Davera has all the required vocabulary that she needs. All right, lower your hands. And then raise your hand if you think, no, there is not an existing OMOP vocabulary to support her request.
Claire, I think there's a third question here. Is this a vocabulary problem?
Yep. Okay, so it looks like we're saying no, but I agree. It sounds like for what Davera, what you are looking for, you may not necessarily need to change the structure of the CDM itself, but maybe you're just looking for the addition of those vocabulary items. And so this is a really good illustration because what we in the working group, we tried to work through this decision tree and we knew that there would be things that we were missing. So in Davera's case, I'm thinking, okay, like Kristen said, perhaps we need to add a third option or maybe something else at the front page that says, do you really just need vocabulary or are you looking to change the CDM as well? So this is a really good example of how this is going to be a living document as we respond to the needs of the community. So I think let's answer the next one. Is there an existing open source vocabulary that has not yet been incorporated into the OMOP vocabulary? So I think this one I'm not so sure about. I think I'd like to ask Davera this question. So is there an open source vocabulary that we can just kind of give to the vocab team to have them incorporate it? Or is there something else going on and there is no open source vocabulary?
So let's just focus on the booster vaccines, just for simplicity. Okay. We don't currently have a code, but we would have a source when that code gets released. So right. Okay.
So when the code is released by, I guess, like CPT4, one of those codes, then it would exist.
Right.
Okay. Now in that case, when CPT4 releases those codes, then the OMOP vocab team will pick that up automatically as well. So in this case, I would hit yes, and maybe what I would do, I would say, hey, I know that there's a new CPT4 code coming down. Can you please prioritize this? So it's not necessarily that we have to bring in a whole new vocabulary. It's maybe just bringing the vocabs team to their attention that you guys are waiting on this new booster code, and could they maybe prioritize that CPT4 update? Or maybe you ask them, where is the CPT4 update in your roadmap? Because I know that they do have roadmaps that they can share, and they can maybe give you an idea of when that will be incorporated.
That's right.
Okay, awesome. So now I know I need to add to the front page of this, is this a purely vocab question, or are you looking to change the CDM? So thank you, Davera. Okay, so I hope this was helpful to you guys in the community, just to give you an idea of what we're working on in the CDM working group, how we want to kind of help you reach your goals and make sure that we are supporting all the potential use cases in the community and give you the tools that you need to kind of get to the right place to either ask your question, post a comment, or find some guidance from the groups that hold some of these keys. Yes, Roger, I see your hand. What's up?
I'm just going to unmic. One of the things I noticed at the end of Paul's presentation is that he said we are building it locally ourselves. Is there any scenario in which you would not want to build it locally yourself? I mean, it almost seems like no matter which decision tree you're going through, you should probably build something local, because you're going to have to define the DDL. You're going to have to do programming. I mean, in almost every case, you're going to have to do something local. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that changes the decision tree or not. It's just a consideration.
Yeah, that's a good point. It could potentially change the decision tree, but I know we did build that specifically into one of the steps of the request process, because the only time I see requiring a local implementation is really if you are changing the structure of the CDM, you should have a local implementation or a reference implementation. When it comes to the other side of that is this vocabulary piece. And I think Davera and your group in M3C have started to create some local codes. But I think that, to me, that's more dependent on what you are doing, what your use case is, and how quickly you need it. I know we've done some of that at J&J as well, when maybe one of our drugs has recently been, put to market, and it takes a little bit of time for the NDC codes to catch up, for the HCPCS codes to catch up. So we might create that code until such time that it's picked up by the OMOP vocabulary. But in that case, in the vocabulary case, I would say it's more use case dependent. And if you are looking to change the structure of the CDM, we would expect at some point, should you get far enough in that process, that you would have to create a local implementation. But great question. Thanks.
Hi, this is Arthur at Mount Sinai. I have a question. Are there any people who are engaged in proposing CDM changes to incorporate genomic variants?
Yes, I think Paul and Chan have been working on some of this. Not to put you again on the spot, Paul.
No. So as part of the imaging, we actually, so the oncology group has brought in some genomic variant features, and so certainly Asia can talk more about what's been done in the oncology working groups. And so, but yet one of the things we did with imaging is we went around to say, hey, genomics is very similar. So is devices and telemetry. And so we wanted to see how other groups and NLP, we wanted to see how other groups took what we consider relatively raw data from outside the EMR and bring it into structured data that we could fit into OMOP. So it was really useful for us to go with one of the first things we did was we brought in the oncology group and asked us to describe how they would bring in, how they brought in features. And they did it, they did some shortcuts. They chose not to bring in provenance for those features, but they did bring in the variant features.
And to your question, Arthur, actually, one of our newest J&J team members, Dimitri Dimshitz, we were talking about genetic variants the other day, and he was actually showing me in the vocabulary that they have been actively working on adding those genomic variants into the vocabulary. So that's actually like already a step in the right direction. And there's actually a pretty good build out so far. I know they're still working on it, but it's already there if you wanted to take a look and potentially think about how you might map that data or use that data, either locally or in absence of a change to the full CDM structure.
Thank you, Claire. I know Paul already. What was the name of the second person you mentioned?
Chan, and Patrick just linked their paper that they wrote, and because I know our colleagues in Korea have done some more extensive work with genomic data. So he is, I don't know if he's first author, but I know he's an author, Sang-Chan Yu.
Thank you, Patrick.
All right, so like I said, we're going to keep working on this, and as these things come in, I'm actually going to go make that change to the decision tree this afternoon, so you'll see that go through on the website. But I hope this is helpful to you guys. Please feel free to reach out. Like I've said multiple times, you'll see it all the way in decision tree. Like, please just reach out, post a Teams chat, post an issue if you're not sure. And I wouldn't blame you, because it is a lot of work once you start going down that path of the request process. So just reach out and let us know, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction.